Hello BookTube. For this Tag Thursday, I'm going to be doing the blue cheese tag. This tag was created by Josh of Literary Gladiators, and it is the 28th in his foodie tag series, which are amazing. So let's get started. Blue Crumbles. What genre are you most likely to collect in mass market paperback? Science fiction and fantasy. Generally speaking, science fiction and fantasy are very frequently published originally in mass market paperbacks. Only more recently have science fiction and fantasy novels and collections received a hardback or a trade paperback release, although now most releases are in hardback or trade paperback, with mass markets coming in much later. But out of all of the fiction in my collection, I am most likely to have science fiction and fantasy in mass market paperback. Roquefort. Who is a pioneer in a favorite genre of yours, and how much of their work have you read? For this, I'm going to go with Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan, Kull, and Solomon Kane. Robert E. Howard is the father of sword and sorcery, a subgenre of fantasy. I've read all of the Conan stories, all of the Solomon Kane stories, I think a few of the Kull stories, and some of his other work, not only sword and sorcery, but also adventure, horror, which are very Lovecraft inspired. But I don't think I've read all of his work, far from it. Gorgonzola. A work that felt like it broke many writing traditions, but resulted in something extraordinary. So for this, I'm going to go to my little tablet and see, who did I pick for this one? Oh yes, Cain by Jean Toomer. Cain is a mixture of short story collection and poetry. Written by Jean Toomer, who was an African-American writer and poet living in the early 20th century, and Cain is an amazing work. And I honestly had some struggle with this prompt until it just, Cain, popped into my head, because I read it for an experimental poetry class during my brief period in graduate school, and really enjoyed it. So yeah, so I think Cain definitely hits this prompt perfectly. Stilton. Talk about a female writer in British literature you feel deserves attention. So I struggled with this prompt because my initial reaction, my initial go-to answer would have been a canonical female British writer who has maybe sort of fallen out of favor, or a little known or mid-list contemporary British writer who writes sort of in the more general fiction or literary fiction genres. So I was going to go with Aphra Behn after much debate. She's famous for writing the early proto-novel Orinoco. I think that was Orinoco. I could be wrong. That I quite enjoyed reading for a class, and I think a few other works. But then, as I was getting ready to film this, I'm like, Kenneth Lee! Kenneth Lee was a British science fiction and fantasy writer who wrote during the 70s and 80s and 90s, and who died a few years ago, and whose story is rather tragic in that for all of her prolific writings, how important she was, particularly in the fantasy of the 70s and 80s. By the time of her death, her work was really in decline as in like consumption. That she wasn't getting the publishing deals that she'd had. That editors and publishers were not accepting her work, and it was shortly after her death that I think Del Rey started to reissue some of her backlist. So hopefully she's gotten the credit and the attention she's long deserved. But yeah. Question number 4. Huntsman. Which two characters from two different works that are somewhat different from one another would you ship? I've racked my brain about this, and I don't really have an answer. I mean, I don't. So I'm going to kind of skip it. Maytag Blue, a work or writer with Iowa roots. For this, I'm going to go with the poet Jory Graham, who I want to say studied at the Iowa Workshop. The Iowa Workshop is part of the writing program of the University of Iowa that really has turned out a tremendous number of excellent, according to some readers, writers, including Jory Graham. Bleu d'Auvergne, or Auvergne, sorry if I butchered the pronunciations on some of these. A work that is easier to enjoy in a modern translation, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And a lot of classical and earlier epic poetry, definitely modern translations are much better, but certainly the Epic of Gilgamesh. I love one of the more recent translations. Cabrales, a great collection or source of nonfiction works by several writers. This one also gave me some trouble, but then I'm like, well, what about the Encyclopedia Britannica or something similar to that? Like an encyclopedia that fills the gamut of knowledge and it has many different writers. Might be a bit of a cheat, but hey. Dolce Latte, a light and cozy work. So this prompt gave me a bit of a trouble too, because when you think of light and cozy, you think of sort of the literary equivalent of candy or cotton candy or something like that. I mean, something that's not all that serious. But then I'm like, well, I mean, light and cozy can be every bit as useful, as important as meteor work, however you define that. But then I'm like, well, this is mostly, I mean, thinking about it in terms of fiction, but wouldn't a light and cozy history really have as much importance as something that's a bit grimmer or something like that? So I went with Sunny Days by David Camp. Sunny Days is a history of the educational children's television revolution in the late 60s and early 70s that saw the advent of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Sesame Street, The Electric Company, and many other educational children's television, not only on what would become PBS, but also on a few local commercial channels. And Sunny Days is an amazing book. It is just so wonderful, so light and cozy and comforting, even though how it ends with obviously most children's television returning to pretty much being nothing more than extended toy ads or what have you, that the educational value really, or educational television for children really being only on PBS for decades, thanks largely to the Reagan Revolution, which, anyway. But definitely Sunny Days is a wonderful, light and cozy history that is just absolutely amazing. Edelpilzkase. I'm almost certain I butchered that one. A noble, fictional or non-fictional subject whom you learned through reading dealt with a physical or mental defect. I really could not come up with an answer to this one. I know there was a book on autism I read years ago that I thought was really good, but for the life of me, I cannot recall the title or the author. I mean, this is like 6-7 years ago, no longer than that. Probably closer to 8 years ago since I read it. Fictional, I don't really want to hazard a guess because, in a way, sometimes a fictional depiction doesn't quite get it right. So, I don't know. Saint Augur, an accessible work from a writer filled with knowledge on the subject. I'm going to go with Children of Ash and Elm by Neil Price. This is his History of the Vikings and is the most recent book that I have completely finished. And it's really good. And I'll talk about I'll talk more about Children of Ash and Elm tomorrow with weekly reads. But suffice it to say, it is an amazing history of the Vikings. So detailed, so accessible, just really good. Bellingham Bleu, a work of Irish literature that shows dedication. I could not think of an answer to this one. I am sorely lacking in Irish literature. So my best throwout would be Dubliners by James Joyce. And Bleu Costello, a young but sharp and straightforward writer, character, or subject. Again, this one I really couldn't think of an answer for. Yeah. So 14. What is your favorite blue cheese? I don't really eat blue cheese. I don't think I've ever really had blue cheese. The most of my cheese eating is like cheddar and Parmesan, occasionally feta, and whatever the hell American cheese is. And as for who do I tag everyone. So if you would love to do this, or if you would like to do this tag, consider yourselves tagged, and I will see you tomorrow with a book haul, because I need to do a book haul. It's getting ridiculous back there, and a weekly read. So until then, BookTube, thank you. Have a great afternoon and evening, and I will see you tomorrow. So until then, stay safe.